back up. Okay, any questions from you guys before we start today? The next test will be, I'm looking at, unless like the power goes out in the next 5 minutes, which you never know, probably next Monday, because we'll be finishing up the chapter today for sure. I mean, this is probably going to be a short class. Then we'll do the review on Wednesday, and the test will be next Monday. So that will be that. I can't think of anything else. So if there's nothing from you guys, we can get back into the stuff. Oh, and as a reminder, for you here physically in class, if you can get the paper to me physically, that'd be great. Like if you can print it out and hand it in, it'll be much easier for me to grade and keep organized, because my 2.5 online classes are going to fill up my inbox. If you need to email it to me, that's fine. It's just you won't get the grade for a while, because that's the email stuff I have to go through separately. So, all right. Let's get into the remainder of the chapter. Put this over here. Blah. Oh, there's the test key. All right. So we ended here with what? Oh, yeah. The Native Affairs, the land claims. With the new Congress being formed, they were trying to deal with two problems at once, which is to say the Native Americans that didn't want them there, and also the land west of the Appalachians, which the people wanted to settle. And it was very difficult to do both of those at the same time, because obviously going past the Appalachians into the lands where a lot of natives had retreated to was very much seen as encroachment, and it's hard to make friends with people whose land you're taking. And I mentioned Dragon Canoe, the Cherokee chieftain who fought the settlers here in the South, whereas his sister Nancy Ward, or Nyan He, was more supportive of the Patriots. So the Cherokees were a bit split on who they were going to work with. And then also this idea of Western claims is why Maryland wouldn't sign the Articles of Confederation until the lands to the west of the Appalachians had been made into basically federal lands that would be split up into new states, as opposed to simply expanding the states that were already there, because Maryland didn't have any land, and they were not happy about that. So I had this map here that I showed you guys of some of the really weird claims that the various states had made. To be fair, Virginia was like the first colony, so it claimed like everything and then gradually walked it back. A lot of these don't make a whole lot of sense. And as I said, North Carolina just going west along the borders that it had made more sense. And then you can see right here, like that's just Tennessee. And then I had this here, Nancy Ward and Dragon Canoe. All right. So regardless of who wanted or who was claiming what in the West, there was still plenty of fighting happening in the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys. The British and their native allies would attack the American and Spanish settlers there. And for the most part, the Patriot forces didn't have much in the way of a coordinated response. But the folks we did have out there were, well, I mean, they were essentially frontiersmen, so they were ready to take care of things on their own. One such man was George Rogers Clark, a surveyor from Virginia who helped to counter the native raids and work with the British to, not work with the British, work with the French and Spanish against the British, eventually leading a surprise attack at Vincennes, which was a fort there in the west. The British still held Detroit, but the attack against St. Louis was defeated by the Spanish there, which allowed for the Spanish, French, and American forces to maintain control in the Ohio River Valley, which was like supremely important, not just for later settlement, but just for like strategic reasons, because rivers, as we're going to see, I mean, really until just about 1900, rivers were this major source of transportation, both for commerce and for military troops. So taking a river valley and essentially taking control of the river would deny that to the enemy. We also had General John Sullivan, who led troops against various native tribes, oftentimes just like burning villages, men, women, and children, regardless of whether they were combatants or not, because that's how American troops do. Massacre of more than 100 Delaware men, women, and children who had converted to Christianity and declared themselves neutral, but hey, they're all the same to the American troops. And once the revolution was done, obviously conflicts between the American settlers and the natives would not simply end. There was going to be a lot of land disputes, and eventually just folks like Andrew Jackson, who was just like, screw it, either we send them further west or we murder them all. He was pretty good at doing both. Still, though, in the short term, the Americans, French, and Spanish had taken control of the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys, which, as I said, was a major strategic victory, keeping the British off of the rivers and essentially forcing them to stay up in Canada in regards to what would become the Midwest. So you've got George Rogers Clark here receiving the surrender of the British fort. And I believe this is St. Louis. You've got the folks charging across the field, and I mean the guys here fighting with like farming implements. But you also have this big tower here in the back, which, based on the amount of fire and smoke, and you can kind of see here, they got cannons up here, and you don't want to be downwind of that. Also, thing here of Major General John Sullivan, revolutionary patriot, soldier, politician, yada yada yada. Led a campaign against Six Nations in New York, which is to say, murdered a lot of natives, whether they were against us or not, and then did some political stuff afterwards. So yeah, here we have the massacre of the Christian Indians, because again, not all of them were like working with the British against the Americans. Most of them remained neutral because they didn't want to get involved. And then you even had ones that had converted to Christianity and were more or less guaranteed safety, but obviously that didn't always work out. Anyway, down here in the South, it was a lot easier for the British because there were so few people actually living here in the South. They captured Savannah in 1778 and then took control of Georgia. one of the generals, General Clinton, was called north, so General Cornwallis had to handle the region by himself. He retook Charleston, and Loyalists overran South Carolina because, again, we didn't have a whole lot of settlements here in the Carolinas, and just in the South in general. And the settlements we did have, I need to make sure that the sound was working earlier, but I need to be sure. Okay. I hate to be this far in and then realize I don't have sound. So Banastre Tarleton led a group of loyalists who slaughtered civilians and surrendered patriots. So we responded by doing the same to them. There was a lot of war crimes happening down here in the South. Thomas Sumter. I think it's supposed to be Sumner. Doesn't matter. He led a group that slaughtered loyalist civilians near Hanging Rock. So a lot of civilian reprisals on both sides. As far as actual battles, General Gates attempted to head south to help the Continental forces, but was defeated by Cornwallis in Camden around the same time that Benedict Arnold's betrayal was discovered. So there was a lot of morale, a major loss of morale at this time. Again, Benedict Arnold was like a major general in the war, and due to, his wife was a loyalist, and he felt like he was being snubbed after all the work that he did. He was, instead of being promoted to like another rank of general, I guess, they put him in charge of a fort, which is kind of boring compared to like marching across the land and fighting the British. And between him feeling snubbed and his wife essentially convincing him that the British would treat him better, he turned the fort over to the British, which the fort that he was at, I can't remember the name of the fort, but it's on the mouth of the Hudson River, not Hudson River. I can't remember the name of the river right there in New York. It was a major part of New York, and luckily we were able to run him out of there, and he retreated with the British. But it would have been a pretty big deal if it had gone through the way they wanted. And even then, after all this, he went back to Britain with his wife and was treated really poorly because he was a traitor, and the British also treated him like crap. It's like he turned against the American forces to help the British, but because the war was lost, they just you didn't do anything anyway, and now you're a traitor, so nobody's going to trust you. Anyway, back here in the South, Major Patrick Ferguson was routed at Kings Mountain, which was able to push the British back for a little while. Nathaniel Greene came down to replace Gates and used the tactics that Daniel Morgan and Francis Marion used, which is to say, guerrilla tactics, hitting and fading, not just standing in a field and shooting at the other guys. So we had a victory at Cowpens, which is a battlefield we may be able to talk about for the end of the semester in the Civil War. And technically the British won at Guilford Courthouse, but they had pretty substantial losses, which forced them to retreat after the battle. So this is leading us to the end game. Cornwallis retreated to Yorktown, Virginia, which was still in Loyalist hands, and fortified the place to wait for General Clinton to come back down from New York and reinforce him. Because at this point, after Guilford Courthouse, despite the fact that technically the British won, they were able to force the Patriots to quit the field, as they say, to retreat. but they lost so many troops that he was not going to be able to maintain parity in another battle, so he got out, hoping for reinforcements, which, as we're going to see, never came. So I believe this is Charleston being hit from the coast, or further inland, rather. Charleston's on the coast. I believe this is Tarleton. And Thomas Sumter, regardless of whether the British had surrendered or not, he was real good at just shooting them anyway. So I've got a few things of battles here. I guess this would be, yeah, this in Camden with the Patriots being defeated. And things, this is just showing how with the guerrilla tactics, there was less of the standing in line and shooting at each other and more the guys hiding behind trees and taking pot shots. So I believe this is Cowpens. You've got the guys lined up here. They had better ground. I don't remember if I explained to this class specifically, like why this was the way things were done back then. It seems dumb in the modern day, but back then they had smoothbore muskets, which means they were horribly inaccurate. I always say, you know, if I had one and was trying to shoot one of you, there was be an equal chance that it would hit the wall over here or somebody on the other side of the room. Because once that smooth musket ball came out of the end of the musket, it would go whatever direction it felt like. So essentially, an entire unit of guys would be one big shotgun, and they would just shoot all at once and hope something hit and reload while the other guys did the same. Like hiding behind trees and shooting at dudes one at a time, it hurt the morale of the other guys because that's not what they're used to, but it's not very often you actually manage to hit them. So this was the tactics of the day. The reason that the Civil War was so bad is by the time we get there, we're still using these tactics, but we have rifled barrels, which causes the musket ball to spin, and that keeps it accurate. So we had this, but with more accurate guns. And also even rifled cannons, which was horrific, because now the cannons are really accurate. Yeah, that's the difference in this and the Civil War, is the guns are more accurate. And then here we have the Americans retreating at, we have here Guilford Courthouse. Again, this is a very well organized group of musketmen here. We've got one group crouched and another group standing up, so you've got like a double line of guys. And a lot of times you would have like another line behind them, so after the first guy is shot, they could retreat behind the line and be reloading while the next guys are shooting. So it would be like a constant wave of fire. So on to Yorktown. This is the final major battle of the war. Washington working with his French allies. We had Comte de Rochambeau making his way south from Rhode Island. General Lafayette moved in from the shore. Again, Lafayette was exceedingly important in the war, but especially at Yorktown. The French naval vessels also moved into the Caribbean to cut off the British supplies, which left Cornwallis pretty much stranded in Yorktown. So after some fighting, Cornwallis surrendered because not only was he not getting supplies from the Caribbean, the reinforcements that were meant to come down from the north never showed up because the French were also giving them a hard time. So we were able to bottle up Cornwallis in Yorktown. Now, this is considered the end of the war. I mean, obviously right here, the final major battle of the war. But it took 2 more years before they actually, got the peace treaty written out. So while this was going on, the British and colonial forces were skirmishing over territory, but there were no major battles over this, just, territory disagreements, which is really common in this period. I mean, today if there's open conflict, that's something that gets taken care of real quick. But back then, if, say, there was a gunfight between, at the border of North America or the United States and Canada, that was a Tuesday. It wasn't really worth getting involved in unless there was an actual military push into a town across the border. Then it's a problem. But if it's just some yahoos shooting at each other, It's like Florida, but the entire border. In June of 1783, troops were discharged without back pay, which resulted in them nearly mutinying. And this is before the war actually ended, technically. We had men marching on Philadelphia. Washington cut them off, and being Washington, managed to convince them to back down without firing a shot because, as I said, he was more of a people person than he was a strategic genius. But sometimes that's what you need. You need to be able to keep your troops from, shooting you. Also, actually, before we get that, remember this for after the test when we get into chapter 7, because this happens again, but with a different group that are treated a bit more fairly. Anyway, the Treaty of Paris was finally signed in September of 1783, which, I don't know, my mind, I feel like this should be the date we remember, as opposed to July 4th when we wrote a piece of paper and said, hey, we're at war now. I don't know. That's just me. The reason it took 2 years from the last major battle was because the Comte de Vergennes, who was the foreign minister for France, didn't like the idea of the sort of government we were putting together. This whole democratic republic and not having a monarch and really actually a very weak central government. They didn't agree with that, and also considered the American delegates to not be their political equals, which is kind of crap, but also is something that America does to every other country we get involved in, especially in the Caribbean. We'll talk more about that next semester, but specifically Cuba. They were fighting a war of independence, and they had already almost won it, and then we got involved so that we could be part of the peace, and fought Cuba when they didn't do what we told them to do. I don't know. We didn't exactly rise above our past. Anyway, the land that was promised here, America got everything south of Canada down to Florida, but stopping at Florida because, as we're going to see here, Spain got Florida back, and west to the Mississippi River. So the lands that essentially the colonies were prior to the war, except for Florida, because Florida, we hadn't really settled it yet. There was still a lot of Spanish settlers living there, and also most of Florida is, the Everglades or natives that really don't want us there. So we're just you know what, Spain, thanks for the help. You can have the land back. So here we have the battle at Yorktown, and actually a strategic map of the siege, because obviously it was walled off, and we had various lines of attack here, with the French just sinking the hell out of the British out in the water. We have the mutiny at Pennsylvania Lane, or the Pennsylvania line, I should say. Yeah, this is kind of an intense image here. You've got to do with double pistols about to get shanked by bayonets, and they were fighting over, not being paid. So there wasn't this extreme unity among the Americans, which is something we've already discussed many times. But I mean, even here towards the end of the war, these soldiers who had been fighting didn't get the pay they were promised. They were like, if you're not going to pay us, we're not going to fight for you. In fact, we're going to cause some trouble. Which is weird that, that's a common thing. We'll see the same thing in, the Great Depression at the end of next semester with people not getting paid. So this was the end result. So we've got the new United States here. Britain still has all of Canada and, some stuff down here in the Caribbean. Spain still has this. Eventually they'll give it back to France, but don't worry about that right now. And of course, Spain gets Florida. There's also these areas of disputed land, but that's also really common, especially over here. Once we do finally get the Louisiana Purchase, all of this is still a problem. But again, we'll get to that later. So, everyone was surprised with this victory, including the Americans, because we had fought what was essentially the most powerful empire in the world, and managed to not all die, for one. Now, obviously, there were a lot of reasons for this, one of which being the 7 Years' War, where most of our officers had gotten, on-the-job training, as it were. No amount of, drills and training, at a military base will prepare you for war like a war will. So most of our major officers had fought in a war, and not just recently fought in a war, but they had fought on battlefields that they were going to fight on again. So they also had a lay of the land. Also, something that's often mentioned is the British were not ready supply-wise. They were across the ocean from Britain. They had Canada and the Caribbean, but it was pretty easy to cut them off from those areas. So the British were fighting at a major disadvantage. And also they were a month from any kind of command structure within Britain. Also, their outside assistance was different in how they viewed the outcome of the war. The British had their Hessian mercenaries, native allies, and the freed blacks, who all had their own goals for this war, or at least for their own personal benefit. Because none of them were gung-ho British allies. They were there for their own reason. The Hessians were there to get paid, and a lot of times if a battle is going poorly, mercenaries are going to leave because you can't spend money if you're dead. The native allies were fighting for their own benefit more than the British. So once the British were retreating, the natives went their own way. And with the freed blacks, well, they were fighting for their freedom. And they didn't really care if the British won or not. They just were there to fight for the British to maintain their freedom. So when the British were retreating, they weren't like, oh, we'll fight to the end to protect the motherland. It's like, no, we're going to go with you guys because you said you'd get us out of here. On the other hand, the Americans had the French and Spanish, who, while they weren't necessarily fighting for, say, American independence as much as they were eager to fight the British. And also, though, if this war was successful, they would gain advantages beyond North America. They would gain, lands in, say, the Caribbean. There would be a shift of power in Europe, and also other parts of the world where the British, Spanish, and French are going after one another. There would be a shift in the balance of power, mostly for the French, because again, Spain was a dwindling nation by this point. And also, when it came to actually winning the war, as we saw, the British did end up taking Philadelphia, which was technically our capital at that point. But the colonies were, how should I put this? The disunity of the colonies was both a positive and a negative for us. Obviously, it's a negative because we were having a hard time just freaking working together. But also, there was no, national identity yet. So taking Philadelphia didn't really matter to anybody else. It's like for Pennsylvania and maybe the regions nearby. It was like, oh, man, they took our capital. But, the guys fighting down here in the south or the guys fighting further in the north they didn't care. That didn't mean anything to them. So for the British to truly win the war, they'd have to go through every colony and defeat every local militia to get the war to actually end. At this point, so much of the population opposed the British that even if they did crush the colonial army, even if they did, say, capture or kill Washington, it didn't matter. There were still so many people who opposed the British that they would keep fighting. Even if the war ended and the British regained control of the colonies are going to be causing trouble for a long time. See all of Irish history. So, a lot of popular histories and even the folks at the time treat the Declaration of Independence as this major starting point for the war. The slide into rebellion had been gradual over, as we saw, the last 3 chapters, really, or at least the last 2. And really moving towards the Declaration of Independence was somewhat reluctant. I mean, it wasn't until after the Battle of Bunker Hill that most people were agreeing that we should go ahead and have our push for independence. But there was still dissent among the Continental Congress. As I said, a lot of more simple historians were like, oh, the Declaration of Independence happened and everybody was fighting the British. But as we've seen, that wasn't the case. Most of the soldiers who were fighting in the Continental Army wanted to return home to, a regular domestic life as opposed to maintaining, career soldier status, which some did, but for the most part it was, I'm done fighting, I'm going to go back home and do my thing. But as we're going to see coming into the next chapter, the government wasn't able to pay them for their service, which is going to cause lots of issues, and also showed that the new American government was not in a good place financially, from the start, which is a common thing with revolutions. And then as people moved west, these financial issues would continue to rear their ugly head, farmers and natives coming into conflict, and the government not being able to help out because, again, the government had no money. And the way the Articles of Confederation were written, the government didn't really have a way to make money. So on top of that, we had the folks who had been leading the revolution: Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, John Adams. Often would travel abroad and work with other nations. There were a lot of these guys were ambassadors to England and France, whereas Thomas Paine was helping the French prepare for their own revolution. But we'll get into that next time. So yeah, that's the rest of chapter 6. Rather than trying to squeeze the review into the next, 35 minutes, we'll just do it next time. So yeah, that's the last of chapter 6, and we'll do the review on Wednesday.